Welcome, bonjour, bienvenue, bienvenidos. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Many of you are joining from different time zones. Thanks so much. This is the global launch of the third edition of Progressing National SDGs Implementation. Thanks to all of you for joining. I'm really delighted to say that while right now we've got 83 people, more than 700 people registered for this event from 105 different countries. So there's clearly a huge amount of interest in the report, in the Sustainable Development Goals, in the Voluntary National Review process. And I think this report is going to signal a lot of information about what we've learned in terms of where countries are in terms of implementation. So I'm now going to just share the screen with you. I'll walk you a little bit through our agenda and what we have planned. I'm going to initially just start with a very quick overview of the report. We also learned from just the survey that you all filled in that about half of you who registered, so around 350 of you, had heard of the report. Another half didn't know anything about it. So it's great to have a mix of people who are already familiar and already who don't know about it. So it's a good opportunity to raise that awareness. So maybe I'll just jump to the first slide to give you a bit of an overview. So I'm going to quickly run you through the next hour and a half what we're doing. For the most part, I'm going to be having a conversation with Shannon Kindernay, who is the lead researcher for the report. Then we're going to go out to you for questions. We've got about 20 minutes to 30 minutes for questions. So you should start thinking as you're listening to what Shannon has to say, some of the things you'd like to learn a little bit more about. And you can start populating those questions in the chat box. We've got somebody who's going to be monitoring the questions. And then I'm going to hand over to a few colleagues who are just going to talk about some of the core elements of the report and why 2019 is such an important year. There's a lot of big events happening during this year, and it's the end of the first 4-year cycle of reviews. So that's important. It's an important advocacy moment. Somebody else is going to be talking about capacity development and how we can build capacity of civil society to engage in the VNR process. And then I'm also going to ask another colleague to talk a little bit about how we're going to be using this report moving forward. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to ask your questions. We're just going to start right now. And as I mentioned, I'll give you a quick overview. And yes, for those who were curious, the PowerPoint for this presentation is available in Spanish and French. There should be a link in the chat box. La présentation en PowerPoint est disponible aussi en français. Vous pouvez le télécharger et on va mettre le lien dans la boîte chat. También tenemos el PowerPoint en español y ustedes pueden conseguirlo con el link que vamos a provide. Disculpe, mi español no está muy... Okay. Everyone, again, just a reminder, please mute your microphones. And so we're just going to start sharing the screen, and we'll go over to the slides. So if we go to the second slide. There we go. So as I mentioned, and I'm going to be speaking very briefly before I hand over to Shannon, this is really a collaborative effort. I'm Fraser, I should have introduced myself. I'm Fraser Riley King. I'm the Research and Policy Manager with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. We're a national platform based in Canada, and all of our members are Canadian organizations that do international development and humanitarian work. And we've been collaborating over the past 2 years, building on a report that Bond, the British equivalent, did in 2016. We've been collaborating with a number of groups to produce these reports, now the third edition. This year we partnered with ActionAid, Action for Sustainable Development, Bond, CAFA, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, FORES, ISD, Site Savers, Together 2030, World Vision, WWF UK, the Arab NGO Network for Development, CIPE in Colombia, and also got resources for the report from Child Fund, Christian Children's Fund, Waterloo Global Science Initiative, and the UK Sustainable Development Network. So it's a very collaborative effort. We're still looking for more partners for next year's report. And this year, as in previous years, we managed to actually review all of the voluntary national reviews that were presented. So we looked at the English, the French, the Spanish, and the one Arabic report. That's the first time, I think, in the 3 editions that we managed to include all of the VNRs. We looked at across a broad set of pillars on a range of different ways that the countries are implementing the SDGs, and we organized these 10 pillars into sort of 3 streams of work linked to governance and institutions, the policies that countries need to put in place to implement the SDGs, and then a range of issues around means of implementation. This was sort of, this report is quite different, I think, from the one that the Department of Economic and Social Affairs produces. That's more of a synthesis of the reports provided. This adds a little bit of more an analytical element to the VNRs, as well as some sort of fact-checking against what civil society indicates their countries are doing. And then finally, we also looked at the Secretary General Common Reporting Guidelines for voluntary national reviews, just to get a sense of how countries are using them. So that's all from me, really, just in terms of the formal introduction. As I said, I'm now going to engage in a conversation with Shannon about the findings of the report. So again, as you hear things of interest, please again populate that chat box with your questions. We'll be coming back to it. But now over to you, Shannon. So Shannon Kindernay is the lead researcher for the report. She's an adjunct professor with the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs that's at Carleton University here in Ottawa. So thanks for joining us today, Shannon.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So you're the lead researcher, but you didn't do this work alone. Who else worked with you on the report?
Yes, obviously you can imagine reviewing all 46 voluntary national reviews, and in a number of different languages required a team. And so for that team, we had Javier Sarasky, who is an area coordinator on governance for development research at CIPE, based in Colombia. And he managed looking at all of the Spanish reports, so Latin America and the Caribbean, but also he looked at the report for Mexico. Nathalie Rees, who is a thematic expert on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She helped out on the French voluntary national reviews. And we had Anas El Hasnoid, who's an associate development expert for the Arab NGO Network for Development, who looked at the Bahrain voluntary national review. And what each of these people were responsible for was collecting all of the data against our 10 pillars of analysis. In the report, they also prepared the profiles, which we'll talk about in a minute, on each of the countries, which are essentially our snapshots of how countries fare against our 10 pillars. They also provided me with examples of best practice and good practice that we included in the report.
Okay, great. So we have a bit of a sense of who worked on the report. Before we delve into the findings, I want to get a sense of who you are out there. So as I said, 700 people registered from 105 countries. We always know that things come up and people can't necessarily join the webinar. So I'm curious to know, we're going to launch a poll now just to get a sense, and that I think will also help us situate our responses to the findings. So we're going to launch a poll that I'd invite all of you to respond to, just to give us a better sense of who you are. So the poll, which we'll launch hopefully now, is just asking you questions. Hopefully everyone can see that up on their screen. So this is your opportunity to vote. We want a sense of where you are in the world. So we've kind of broken the world down into regions. Apologies for combining Southeast Asia with South Asia. I know you're a different region, but we only had the option of 10 choices. So it's a sense of where you are in the world. We see those numbers moving. Lots in North America, we'll just watch that. You can keep on answering the other questions. We'll just maybe take a look at that. We also want to know the type of organization you're with. Whether you've engaged in a voluntary national review process so far. So again, a mix. Numbers are still coming in. Whether you'd heard of the report today, so clearly those who saw last year's report are coming back again, which is great. And then of course, you've heard of the report, but have you actually read the report? Here's the real teller. So the numbers there are encouraging, and so
I like it that says you actually read the report.
Yeah. And maybe some people read it, but it was so memorable that they don't remember. Okay, so that some good degree of familiarity with the report, which is useful. So we'll be talking a little bit about how the changes, how the report has changed, rather. Maybe we'll just take a quick look back up, just to see the numbers. So North America did.
Well, Europe is 41%.
There we've got Latin America, Caribbean. Okay, Europe's very high as well. So a good mix, low, standing on the Asian front, perhaps because of the time, and not a huge number from Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's also something to keep in mind when we go to Ollie Henman, who's going to be talking about the different ways that we're going to be using the report through the work of the regional commissions. Maybe let's just look at the second thing to get a sense of the types of organizations. So also largely nationally focused organizations, but also some national, which is also positive. So thanks for filling that in. I think we can keep those results. Again, it's a useful indicator of who's listening. So maybe I'll now jump back to the PowerPoint itself, just with the help. We're going to end the poll now. And there we're going to share the results with people. So maybe Mark, if you can just jump back to the sharing. Okay, so we're going to skip to the next slide. And what I want to hear first from you is, as I mentioned, the report has shifted, so we can go to the one after that. The report has shifted a little bit from last year, but can you first tell me a little bit about the key features in the report? What do you think is useful in the report?
Yeah. So, I mean, for those of you who read last year's report, you know that it's quite a lengthy report. We cover almost virtually every aspect of implementation of the 2030 agenda. So something that we've tried to do to facilitate reading is, we have a shorter executive summary. We've also prepared chapter summaries related to each of our three kind of large chunks in the report. So governance and institutions, policies, and then means of implementation. And we've also even produced a 2-pager, which I'm sure is available online, of some of the key findings. So we've really tried to kind of facilitate, that quick read for those who maybe don't have time to delve deeper into the report, which of course we still encourage you to do. The report itself also offers a very comprehensive analysis in all the areas that it looks at, and it gives us a bit of a sense of some of the standard practices that we're seeing countries do, but also best practices and good practice. So for good practices, that's where we highlight case studies from countries that kind of exemplify where we think there's some good progress happening. And best practices, those reflect activities that we see being reported in the voluntary national reviews, but they're not necessarily attributed to only one country. Maybe a number of countries are doing those. Of course, we included our comparison of how countries are reporting against the Secretary General voluntary guidelines. And finally, we included the country profiles, which are quite useful for people who are looking to kind of have a quick look at how their country is doing against our pillars of analysis.
Okay. You mentioned good practice and best practice. Can you maybe just help me again distinguish between the two elements?
Sure. So for the good practice elements, what we've done is that's where we're showcasing the actions of a particular country. And in that case, we recognize that, there's a ways for all countries to go in terms of implementing the 2030 agenda. And so we hesitated to call that our best practice, which we actually did in 2017. And upon further reflection, the steering committee for this work thought, it makes more sense to talk about good practices that we see, recognizing that there's always room for countries to improve and to do better. Whereas what we see as best practices are actions that really are above sort of the standard, and that really highlight what we would like, sort of the gold standard that we would like to see other countries take on.
And maybe for the slide, can you just maybe point out, there's a number of images there, so that obviously the best practice spotlight is obvious. What are some of the other pictures that we see there?
So you see there's a case study in good practice. There's the box on the bottom left-hand corner. Then you can see on the top right left-hand corner, we've listed our 10 pillars of analysis. So each has an icon that also helps to direct the reader to where they, to the key issues that they might be interested in. In the very middle of the screen, you have an example of the country profile, where you can again see, essentially you have the name of the country, and you can see the icons helping to direct the reader to the various areas of analysis. And then finally in the top right-hand corner, we see the comparison of the voluntary national reviews against the Secretary General's voluntary guidelines. And there you see that we've used a traffic light system. So green representing when a country essentially followed the guidelines, yellow when they somewhat followed the guidelines, so perhaps they didn't address all the criteria of that guideline, or they addressed it briefly in a different section, and then red is where they did not address that particular area at all.
Right. So maybe I'll jump just to that. So you mentioned the traffic light system. Perhaps we'll talk about what's different this year about the report compared to last year.
So the traffic light system is definitely one of the main sort of differences. We found in the feedback from last year's report, we had included the traffic light system on the actual country profiles. And what we found, that system was meant to indicate whether a country had followed the Secretary General's guidelines. What ended up happening though is I think there was some confusion by readers in terms of interpreting that traffic light as representing actual progress on 2030 agenda implementation, which was not the intent. And so we removed the traffic light system from the actual profiles this year, but still kept it in the overall table, because there you can see a range of progress or areas that were not looked at by countries. So we kept the traffic light system there. A couple of other differences maybe to just highlight in the report is that we found, in reflecting on last year's report, that there wasn't sufficient attention to the environmental dimensions of the agenda. And so one of the things that we did was we really beefed up the analysis in terms of looking at whether countries referred to principles such as planetary boundaries, whether they referred to intergenerational responsibility. But we also looked at whether countries linked their SDG implementation to specific environmental agreements, for example, and others. The other area that we made a fairly positive change, I would say, is around leaving no one behind in the analysis in that section. We did a more detailed approach in terms of categorizing the way that countries are working to leave no one behind. So for example, are they using specialized programs? Are they using universal programs? What's their kind of overall approach that they're using to leaving no one behind? We also added in a gender dimension of the analysis, more specifically looking at what countries say they're doing around gender equality, but also data with respect to disaggregated data in that area. And part of the rationale for that was, of course, the sort of the importance that I think most of us know around gender equality in the sustainable development space. But I think last year in the previous report, because it was subsumed within the broader, looking at broader issues of leaving no one behind, I didn't really get as much attention as it probably should have. And so this really helped us to kind of zero in and ensure we had that focus on gender equality, which is also comes out in the revised Secretary General guidelines. And then maybe the final area to point out is that we also did a more detailed analysis of the partnerships. So the report includes an examination of civil society, private sector, academia, and others in terms of what voluntary national reviews say about partnership. This report includes a much more detailed analysis and categorization of what is happening in that space.
Okay. So we're going to dig into some of those findings very soon. Maybe very quickly, just how do you feel, for people who are listening, How is this report useful? Why might they want to use it?
So I think the report is really helpful in terms of guiding countries and other stakeholders around what is best practice in 2030 agenda implementation, what is good practices that they can look into further. So, we've sort of done the homework on that, which I think is helpful for people. For civil society organizations and others who are engaged in parallel reporting processes, this report also provides a bit of a structure that can be followed. It gives an idea of what are some of the key issues that you might want to consider in that context. And it's also an important tool for advocacy, that countries can use to, or individuals and stakeholders can use to push countries, their governments to adopt best practices or good practices.
Okay, good. So let's jump to some of the content, and you can see some other uses there, using it for advocacy and as a reference. So what would you say, kind of overall macro level picture, what are some of the key findings from this year's report?
So I think a number of our key findings reflect what we saw last year in the report for the 2017 Voluntary National Reviews. We see that countries are, moving forward with integrating the Sustainable Development Goals into their policies. They're setting up institutions. They're exploring partnerships. They're kind of getting what I like to think of as sort of the building blocks of implementation. They're getting those in place. But at the same time, we can see that this really varies still across the Voluntary National Review. So some are much further ahead, for example, in terms of localizing the agenda than others are. Some countries seem to be further ahead in terms of actually having incorporated the goals into their national policies, sectoral policies, and so on, whereas others are still in the process of, defining what those priorities are going to be and then including them in policies and so on. I think the other, another kind of headline finding is around the transformative elements of the 2030 agenda and the extent to which we see their reflection in the implementation through the Voluntary National Review reports. So this is about the principles of the agenda. So, the human rights-based approach, universality, leaving no one behind, and so on. So about those principles, but it's also about the transformative elements related to partnership, having sort of this whole of society approach to sustainable development. And I think we can very much see that there's room for countries to further adopt those principles and those transformative elements of the approach in their implementation. And then I think a final finding that or sort of headline finding that I would highlight is that I'm not convinced that countries are making the most of the Voluntary National Review process. When we look at the extent to which they highlight their best practices, their lessons learned, where they'd like to learn from others, the challenges that they face. We still see those elements underreported despite their reflection in the guidelines. And I think, given sort of that peer learning nature of the high-level political forum and the focus on kind of this review follow-up element, that's a missed opportunity in this process.
And that's probably something to really flag this year as we review the HLPF process, that this is a missed opportunity, that countries, I think, have an appetite to learn, but they're not putting in place enough measures to actually do that peer learning. Great, thank you. So maybe jumping to the next slide, and we'll get into some of the findings more specific. So what can you tell me about governance?
So maybe just a caveat for our audience. What we are going to showcase here in terms of the key findings is really some of the more newer or emerging findings from 2018 that are a bit different than what we saw in 2017. So that is just to recognize that there's a lot more key findings and recommendations in the report than what we'll have time to go over. But here we're just giving a bit of a teaser of some of the really new and interesting, I think, elements that we saw this year versus last year. So the first is really around governing mechanisms and sort of the councils or the committees that are being established within countries to derive overall implementation. And I think a positive finding this year was that we saw an increase in non-state actor engagement in those mechanisms. So whereas in 2017, for example, we saw 6 countries talk about civil society organizations being a part of these governing structures. In 2018, we saw 17 countries talking about them being involved. So I think that's certainly one positive move forward that we saw. At the same time, though, very few reports could provide any information around mechanisms for stakeholder engagement, for ongoing engagement beyond identifying national priorities and beyond engagement in governing structures and in the voluntary national review process. So that for us is I think, an issue that needs to be addressed, something that countries should be reporting on, recognizing that implementation is a long-term process that requires ongoing consultation and engagement with stakeholders. And I think to that effect, one of the things that we offered in the report this year was a set of principles to improve engagement.
Okay, so ad hoc consultations is improved, but still no institutionalized engagement. What do these principles look like then? How do we improve that process of engagement?
Right, so going to the next slide, please. So, in reflecting on different principles that we see in that have been used for engagement processes by civil society organizations, and of course a discussion amongst the group that was really sort of driving this process, we identified sort of the 5 principles that we think are important for engagement within the 2030 agenda context, around sort of ensuring that engagement is timely, so that there's sufficient time for people to engage, that they have enough time to engage and prepare when they're consulted, that it's open so that all different stakeholders are able to access engagement opportunities through models that work, transparency, so ensuring that when engagement's occurring, it's open, it's clear why we're engaging, what we're trying to achieve, that sort of thing. Ensuring that engagement is informed, so stakeholders have documentation they need in advance, they have follow-up following engagement to know how their inputs are actually being used, and then of course that engagement is iterative, so it's an ongoing process, not just one-off or ad hoc consultation.
I mean, these are great principles and ideas, but are any countries actually doing that?
So in the report, so maybe just to highlight, in 2017, we identified as good practice Indonesia's principles for stakeholder engagement. And it was sort of a kind of a part of their report that they highlighted as best practice. And they had a set of principles that were similar, but not quite the same as what we proposed. This year, we didn't see countries necessarily, in their voluntary national review talking about kind of a big set of principles that they had developed. But we did highlight in the report the example of Poland in terms of how they engaged in the voluntary national review process. So for example, they had a task team that included non-state actors to facilitate their voluntary national review, promoting transparency. They created a number of opportunities for broad public consultation on timelines that were sort of set well in advance. So, informed and timely consultations. They also, of course, the consultations were open, and I think, at least in terms of how they were described in the report, they talk about online and offline elements. They talk about actively seeking out social stakeholders, to dialogue on the report, a form on a website that people could submit their ideas, Parliament being engaged, and so on. So, they hit most of the principles that we're suggesting in terms of consultation and engagement, but I have to kind of say they didn't frame it in that way in their report.
So these are principles and practice that maybe people who are listening out there can push for their government to also follow, and maybe even in the HLPF process to try and improve that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving beyond governance, what about the policy side of things? Where are we at in the report?
So we found, in terms of policy, we looked at sort of a number of 4 kind of key elements. One was baseline and gap analysis, and we found very similar findings in 2018 to 2017, with sort of most countries either having carried out some kind of assessment that would inform their policies or planning to do so, but this was still less than in 2017. We then found that, most countries referred to, in terms of sort of the broader principles of the Sustainable Development Goals and incorporating those into their policies and their goals. we found that most countries referred to the leaving no one behind principle. About 41 countries did so, but substantially fewer referred to other important principles and transformative elements of the 2030 agenda. So, for example, intergenerational responsibility and universality were only, referred to by some 16, 17 countries. Human rights-based approaches were not referred to only by 6, and planetary boundaries were only explicitly referred to by 3 countries. So, this is just a kind of a proxy indicator for what that means in terms of how countries are incorporating those transformative principles. But the lack of mention in the voluntary national reviews, I think, is problematic.
And so that points to the earlier message in the key findings that things are still not transformative enough.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of where countries have done a good job at incorporating principles? So
the example that comes to mind that we highlight as a good practice in the report is Australia, in terms of how they talk about human rights and the human rights-based approach to sustainable development. In their report, they talk about human rights as integral to the SDG implementation process. They talk, and the report tries to demonstrate a strong commitment to that effect. So it refers to various international human rights frameworks, legal and institutional frameworks and policies that are available to ensure human rights. And they also talk about the promotion of human rights at regional and global levels. And there is quite a detailed, lengthy conversation in the report around that. And that would be an example, I think, of a country that's really trying to show how human rights are informing, and the rights-based approach is informing their approach to 2030 agenda implementation.
And on the policy front, there's also reference to culture. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. So in 2017, we did an analysis of very broadly of what countries identified as their national priorities. So because countries identified them in very different ways, we kind of left it at the broad level. Do they refer to the economy, to society, to the environment, governance, etc. And in this year, it was a bit interesting in that we had 6 countries refer to culture or issues related to national identity among their national priorities for the 2030 agenda implementation. So that was something that was new compared to last year, and something that we highlighted in the report.
Well, that's sort of an interesting development. Okay. We're going to flip to the next slide, but again, just to mention, if everyone can keep their mic muted, just so that everyone can hear the presentation, that would be great. Thanks.
And so maybe just to finally, a quick element is we do look at, in the framework looking at policies, we do look at sort of the reporting around integration and policy coherence issues. And one of the things we noted this year was a marked improvement in the reporting on all of the SDGs. So in 2017, we saw that a much more limited set of countries, 11 actually before we had looked at all their sustainable development goals in their reports, whereas this figure was 28 in 2018. So that's an improvement in terms of reporting on all the goals. But at the same time, even though most countries refer to all the dimensions of sustainable development, what we found is that in the goal-by-goal analysis, countries still tend to be taking a siloed approach. They don't, we found that there was not as much of a demonstration of the interlinkages between the various goals and between the dimensions of sustainable development being articulated in the reports.
Okay. Are there any best practices on reporting that you want to flag?
On reporting that I want to flag, I think really at the end of the day, the best practice in this particular instance is around reporting on all of the sustainable development goals. Right. And I think, and maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, but is also reporting on progress on those goals, right? So, we have countries that are increasingly going to be repeating the voluntary national review processes. And in that context, I think a best practice is reporting on all of the sustainable development goals and progress since the last time reporting occurred.
Okay, you've got your benchmarks, tell us where you come to.
Exactly.
And so also, we saw in the early days, a lot of countries just reporting on the priorities for that particular HLPF, but we're shifting now away from that?
It seems to be, and I think the guidelines are a bit clearer around that from the Secretary General guidelines, because they dropped the element that was around the thematic analysis, and I think that and really emphasized, you know, reporting on all of the goals, and that maybe is part of what has helped as well.
Okay, maybe let's move on to the next slide. So, means of implementation. Can you talk us through some of the findings in the report on that?
Sure. So in terms of the means of implementation, we found overall that countries reported more frequently on international public finance, on trade, on technology, and on systemic issues. So those are the kind of the key areas that we look at in addition to sort of budgeting and financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. But we really did find that there was sort of much more reporting on those issues, which was great. We also found, however, though, in looking at leaving no one behind, that even though 41 countries reference leaving no one behind in their reports, only 16 really give a detailed, fleshy analysis of leaving no one behind. And I think another sort of key finding around that area is this issue of the extent to which the principle of leaving no one behind is changing business as usual, and how that's integrating into overarching approaches, what that means for existing practices, policies, programs, etc. That doesn't come out in the reports.
Right. And that's really going to require some different thinking to do it. So is there a country that you could profile here that you think is leading the way, or is an example of good practice?
I think a country that we highlighted in the report that I think is a good example of good practice was Bhutan, in terms of how they actually assessed who was being left behind. And so they actually carried out what they called a voluntary vulnerability baseline assessment. And they used that assessment to identify who was being left behind. And they matched that against the population and housing census and so on. But essentially what they were able to do was identify sort of 14 vulnerable groups, and then from there work towards addressing their vulnerabilities and so on. And so kind of really doing that baseline and that groundwork to make sure that they understand who is actually being left behind. I think that's a good practice.
And you really need to know the specifics of those individual groups. Okay, localization.
Right, so in terms of localization, and perhaps we can actually flip to the next slide, please. You know, we really see here that is an area where more work is needed. You know, we had 30 countries provide information on localization efforts in some way or another. But what we actually see is that, you know, only 16 of 46 countries that reported talked about actually integrating the SDGs into local plans and policies. And then we see much less talking about the use of SDG indicators at local levels, and talking about kind of including that local governments in different engagement opportunities and so on. But I mean, I think the slide speaks for itself. We really see quite limited discussion around the local dimensions of this agenda, and that's an area that, you know, more work is needed.
I'd love to come back on some of those previous issues, but I'm cognizant of time. So let's move to the next slide. I mean, this was an assessment done by civil society. So what are you seeing in terms of coverage on an enabling environment for civil society and reporting? Is that covered at all? The government's mentioning that?
So that is definitely an area, a big gap in the voluntary national reviews. So, you know, they've done, the reviews are more comprehensive, I would say, in terms of reporting on different partnerships, civil society, private sector, etc. And we were able to use that information to our advantage this year. But only one country, which is Ireland, actually refers to the enabling environment. And at the same time, this is in a context where 23 of the countries that reported to the High-Level Political Forum in 2018, or sorry, rather 8 of those countries that reported in 2018 are listed as open, according to the civil society, the Civicus Monitor that looks at space for civil society. So the fact that nothing is mentioned about it, but we have so many limited countries reporting that are actually open, it is problematic.
Yeah, and telling.
Yeah.
As well. Okay, so maybe back to just the means of implementation. So
maybe just the final element that we of course look at is reporting and measurement issues related to implementation. And there, you know, we basically found that there was a very limited commitment by countries to actually report on a regular basis. We only had a handful of countries that talked about when they're going to next submit to the high-level political forum, or committed to how they would actually produce national reports and so on.
Okay. Again, maybe we'll jump ahead. So here, I think this slide relates to the fact that, and you've mentioned this already, we have now kind of a handful, or maybe it's more than that, countries who are now reporting a second time. You talked about the importance of, you've set a baseline, report on your progress. What are you finding for those handful of countries that are coming back again to the HLPF?
So the two examples that we have of countries that were actually reported on their progress were Egypt and Switzerland. So it'll be this slide and the next slide. And they took different approaches to indicating progress against their kind of previous report. So with Egypt, as you can see, it's a traffic light system in terms of how they're doing. They've had a negative change, positive change, no change, and so on. And then in the case of Switzerland, if we can go to the next slide. Switzerland developed a system where they essentially indicate what direction they would like the change to go in. They then give an indication of what the actual trend is, and then they give an assessment of whether that's a positive, negative, or unchanged trend. So I mean, those are two examples of countries that did this. Not for all indicators, but certainly for those that were selected as priorities for those countries. The other countries that were second time or I think even third time reporters, I believe Togo, Benin, Colombia, Mexico, Qatar, Togo, and Uruguay did not do this. But I think part of that might also be explained by the fact that these are countries that largely reported against the high-level political theme goals, rather than the full set of SDGs, with the exception of Mexico. So.
Okay, so that makes sense. So this is maybe a good marker for countries that at this coming HLPF and future ones, ways to report on progress.
Right.
We're going to wrap up soon and go to questions, but maybe just the one final element that we include in the report is using the common reporting guidelines of the Secretary General. So those guidelines changed since the last time we did the report. What are we seeing there? What are some of the trends?
So generally speaking, countries report against most of the guidelines, at least sort of as we identified, at least 70% of the countries had reported against all guidelines, except, and I think this is important, the chapter on leaving no one behind, on structural issues, and on statistical annex. So, we're still seeing gaps in terms of sort of key areas and critical issues that we want to see countries report on. We also did note that the reports are not structured necessarily according to the guidelines. I mean, one of the things that I can say is an improvement on last year is last year there was quite a bit of repetition in the reports. And I have to say, certainly for the reports that I read, that has improved. And so there does seem to be more streamlining and less repetition, which makes it a bit easier, certainly, to kind of absorb the reports, and that's a positive.
Right. So they're better structured in a way, but not necessarily according to the guidelines.
That's right.
And I mean, I think that was also one of the things we realized last year using the traffic light system, is that some countries didn't get a good mark because they hadn't followed the guidelines, but those same countries have taken quite a novel approach to reporting,
right,
and were being punished because they didn't follow a set of guidelines.
That's right.
So that also explains why I think we moved on from that. So I'll maybe come back to you with some other questions, but I'd like to open it to participants. We've got probably 20 minutes to hear from you. Are there things that struck you so far in the findings? And we'll probably share that PowerPoint again so you can download it. But we're just going to jump over to the questions to see. Rather than have you activate your mic, I'm just going to try and scroll through them and see if there's things that are coming up. So we're just going through lots of comments. Just looking.
Lots of friendly greetings.
Yeah, everyone seems to be very happy to say hi to everyone. Okay, still muting. Okay. Okay, so some people are looking for partners, and I think we're going to go to that actually probably when we hear from Deirdre and Ollie. A lot of groups have set up mechanisms to help support groups, provide shadow reports or spotlight reports. So people interested in engaging in the report next year. Okay, let's see. Okay, still scrolling through. Okay, so there's a question that we spotted on the traffic light system. So again, this is something that we used just specific to the Secretary General's Common Reporting Guidelines on voluntary national reviews. Right. So how does that work?
So basically the way it works is in the report, we outline what the guidelines are and the different elements that are in them. If a country, for example, on the goals, if they reported on all of the sustainable development goals, they would get a green. They would get, they've met that criteria. If they reported on some of the goals, but not all, it would be yellow because they've, somewhat met that criteria, but not fully. And if they didn't really report on the goals, if they did more of a thematic analysis that didn't really speak to individual goals, targets, and indicators, they would get red for having not met that criteria.
Right.
So that's kind of a very practical way of thinking about how we did that. And of course, because we're a team of researchers, we sort of, had to engage with one another and kind of check, how we were all scoring to ensure that we were scoring the same way. Mm-hmm. And so for example, on leaving no one behind, if a country included the chapter and sort of fleshed out their approach, they would get green. If they maybe talked about leaving no one behind, but it was one little paragraph that doesn't really give us a lot of information, we can say, well, you kind of met that criteria, but not really. And then of course, if leaving no one behind is not talked about at all, anywhere in the report, whether, then they would obviously get red. And so that's sort of how we took that approach across all of the different pillars of the.
And so opposed to last year where we kind of did an aggregate result across all of the different sections, this year it's got a mix of things, right?
So, well, the main difference is last year we aggregated a country's scoring across all of the different sort of sections of analysis. So a country had to receive, I can't remember the exact amount, but a country would have had to receive, say, 12 or 10 or 12 of green in order to get a green overall, or something like that, right? And we had a system where we did it and explained it in last year's report, but that was removed, right? And I think, for reasons we've already explained.
Right. So. But we still do have an aggregate of overall, what are the most popular?
Oh, in that sense, yes, of course. So in the table where we present this information, we actually give an aggregate of the percentage of countries that, met a certain criteria or not. And we actually give a percentage change over 2017 and 2016. So whether there's actually an improvement in terms of reporting against that component, or whether we've seen a decline or the same.
Eamon from Ireland is asking whether we did any analysis in the report on how VNRs are underpinned by human rights norms, standards, indicators.
So in the report, we look at specifically whether countries refer to a human rights-based approach as one of the kind of standard indicators, a yes/no indicator in the analysis. But then what we do is we collect information around if they don't refer to the human rights-based approach, but they maybe refer to human rights, or they refer to any other elements basically related to human rights. We collect that information and then provide an analysis of that in the report. So in this year's report, for example, there were a number of countries that talked about a human rights-based approach to data. And we note that in the report. For example, a number of countries were much more explicit in terms of linking international human rights frameworks to their various goal analysis. So, when they talk about goals related to the social sectors, they would then refer to the international human rights frameworks that are relevant. Or if they talk about youth and children, they might refer to conventions related to, so on. So we do include that in the analysis, but our sort of set indicator that we first look at is whether they actually refer to a human rights-based approach or not.
Okay. I'm going to come back to Brian O'Toole's question, but there's a direct follow-up from Jennifer Thompson. Just, you mentioned that you looked at how countries linked SDGs to environmental agreements. Did we also look at how countries are linking to human rights frameworks and the UPR process, so the Universal Periodic Review?
Right. So The specific human rights frameworks are not included in the various agreements that we look at, where we essentially check off, did you refer, and in that case, what we're usually looking at is more sort of the broader agreements. So we looked at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, International Development and Aid Effectiveness Agendas, the Sendai Framework, disaster risk reduction, and so on. So we looked at sort of broader frameworks, the Paris Agreement, of course, on climate change and so on. But we did not actually look, do we check off the Convention on Civil Political Rights or whatever the case may be. I can say though, certainly for the English VNRs, I cannot remember one that referred to the UPR process at all, maybe Australia, but generally speaking, that is not, I would say, strongly featured in the reports. And I would say the reports that do a better job of linking to the international human rights frameworks are a handful, 2 or 3 maybe.
So something that's still very underreported. And maybe Javier and Natalie, who I think are on the line, can maybe just pop in the chat box if in reviewing the Spanish and French VNRs, if you saw any reference to human rights agreements. I'm going to take a bit of a risk here. I'm going to jump back to Brian's question and just Ollie Henman, if you're online, maybe this is just where I'll go to you to give you a chance to talk about how we're using this report looking forward, how we're looking to engage with civil society, how can we increase civil society attendance at both the VNR process and high-level political forum. Ollie, maybe do you want to say a little bit about how we're going to use...
Hi, Fraser. Yes, I'm here. I'm going to try my video. Hi, everyone. Can you see me okay?
We can hear you. We're just going to see if we can see you. I'm just going to find you first. Anyway, we'll try and pull up your video, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what Action for Sustainable Development's got planned?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Fraser. And I just posted something on the chat box as well, just linking to the website where you can find most of the national civil society reports that Shannon was referring to that have been done over the last few years. I mean, as you say, Fraser and Shannon, the picture is still quite mixed, and some governments are more open than others. There are some good examples out there. I think you mentioned Togo earlier, where this is now the third. Togo had reported for 3 years in a row, and they had quite extensive civil society dialogue. They also integrated the recommendations into their national planning process. So that was a good example. You have other countries like India, Brazil, where there's a very strong national coalition, which is putting pressure on the government, not always being listened to as much as they might be, particularly at the moment in Brazil. I know there are colleagues from Brazil on the call. So it's not an easy picture, but what we can do and what we have been doing over the last couple of years is to provide a toolkit and to provide advice to national partners, national coalitions who are looking to prepare their own report. This year, actually, we had a lot of input from Sri Lanka in particular, based on their experience with what they called the Voluntary People's Review. And we've use some of the methodology that was proposed by Sri Lanka to update the template, and we've called it a People's Scorecard. And this attempts to both look at how well is the engagement process working with your government at the national level, but also, crucially, where possible, can we already start to get some independent evidence to say how far is delivery actually happening, how far can we verify what the government is actually saying in New York at the national level? Because I think one of the big gaps that's been highlighted and has already been mentioned in this report is that feedback loop, so that, you know, governments will present in New York, but there's very little follow-on when they go back home to show that the learning and that the main messages are actually embedded in their national plans back home. And I think that's one of the things that we'd like to ensure, that both before and after the HLPF, there is that embedding of the plans. One other thing I'd like to mention, if I may, which we've been discussing with some of the key organizations like Forus and Together 2030, is to get a letter together that you as national platforms can then use to approach your governments to highlight the learnings from this extensive report and to highlight some opportunities on how to better engage at the national level. So we are looking forward to some of that national advocacy engagement, and we're very open to partnering with many of you. I think there's going to be a big momentum this year, as you say, with the review of the HLPF, and I'm sure others will say more on that. But the more we can build from the national level experiences over the coming year, the better. I did just remember one other thing, which was the regional forums. I know you were keen for me to mention that as well. So both at the national level and then through to the global level, in between, you also have the regional sustainable development forums. We think these are being underutilized at the moment, and we'd like to strengthen the accountability mechanisms at the regional forums. There are great examples out there like UN SCAP, and again, the colleagues on the call who are actively involved in running sessions in the Asia Pacific Forum. But I know from talking to colleagues that both in the Africa region and the Latin America region, it's less, there's less opportunity so far for engagement of civil society. I also know that for the ESCWA meeting in Beirut, there is an emerging coalition of civil society led by ANND, who were mentioned earlier, alongside the trade unions and women's movements in the Arab region. So that engagement at the regional commissions is another big opportunity, and we'll be looking to run workshops, and again, look forward to working with many of you on those. Thanks, Fraser.
Great, thank you so much, Ollie. So that's an important reminder, I think, for everyone. You're listening to this presentation of the report, but in the coming week or weeks, we'll be circulating to you a letter that you can use to send to your focal point on the SDGs in your country, to both profile the findings, but it's also an avenue to start having those conversations at the national level around the voluntary national review and the SDG process. And you can also take it regionally. We saw in the reports this year increased reference to how regions are engaging in the process. Ollie is going to be at a number of the different roundtables. I'm sure many of you others on the call as well. So go there. You'll have an opportunity to learn more about doing sort of shadow reports or spotlight reports or benchmarks, etc. Learn more about the report, connect to groups. So hopefully we'll get Ollie to put up his email address up on there if you want more details on that. And as I mentioned, we'll be sending you out this political note that we've drafted, again, in English, French, and Spanish, hopefully, that you can use to share the report with your contact point and start that conversation. So I think we'll jump back to the questions now, just to make sure that we're covering them. I don't know if we need to go back up again. There's probably lots in, so we might need to be a bit more succinct. There's a question. Okay. Following Eamon's question. Okay. Right. So policies. Are we seeing policies change in countries? That's maybe a little bit of a challenging question. Still lots of questions about the human rights framework, but again, that's maybe something that we need to push on. So maybe just in general progress on policies, and then there's another question here about sort of best or good practice on institutionalizing goals, in particular around sustainability. If there's something you want to say on that.
So the first question around the policies, in 2018, it was half the countries reported that they had already incorporated the Sustainable Development Goals into their national policies and frameworks directly, which is the same number that for the Voluntary National Review, same number of countries that we looked at last year. You know, last year we saw more countries taking an approach where they actually developed a Sustainable Development Goal implementation strategy to go along with how they incorporate into national policies and frameworks. We see that less this year in terms of countries highlighting that approach. I mean, one of the things that's challenging, I think, in this type of analysis is that we have the information from civil society reports for some of the countries that we look at, And we have the information that's provided in the voluntary national reviews. And countries will talk about how they have done this, but we don't actually then go and look at the documentation at country level to say, okay, have they done a good job of this? Have the policies actually really changed? So, you know, with the scale and scope of this report and what's manageable and feasible, that's sort of the best that we can do. I can't say that I see a huge change from what was reported in 2017 to 2018, and rather actually it seems to be more of a consistent, it's more consistent in that, you know, countries talk about incorporating international policies, in some cases moving on to sectoral policies, and they demonstrate or point to which ones those might be. But still, I think the key point is that there's no description of how their overall, often there isn't, I would say, an overall description of how the transformative elements of the agenda are being included. And also, I think another challenge around the policy space is around the integration dimension. And so countries are not necessarily clearly reporting on how they integrate all three dimensions in their approaches and what that really means in practice, you know, moving from policy to programming and so on.
So yeah, just an important reminder that this report is based on what countries are reporting, and so we have to take that as fact. We do have a number of civil society shadow reports that we've included in there that can just kind of validate whether that's true, but some of the more interesting questions, I guess, come with the granularity of looking at exactly what they're doing rather than just what they're reporting on saying they're doing. One question from somebody out there just about why aren't countries making better linkages? Why aren't they better integrating the sustainable development dimensions? Why aren't they doing more around the principles? Is it they just don't know how? Do they need their capacity built?
Well, I think in the report last year, we suggested that that might be an area where countries needed more support, right? We talked about how, you know, the linkages between the goals are not necessarily being made, and we suggested that that might be an area where countries need more support from the United Nations, both in terms of what that might mean in practice, but also in terms of how to report on those issues. I mean, at the end of the day, what we see is, I mean, you have a country reporting on poverty, for example, and not talking about necessarily climate impacts that are going to have that, you know, will face people living in poverty or more vulnerable populations. I mean, that's what we mean when we say that it's not an integrated approach. You have, you know, reports where countries are talking about energy, the goal related to energy, which of course, you know, often you see a clear linkage with the climate goal, and often information is quite repetitive between those two, and they're kind of big bundled together. But you still have countries that are only talking about energy access and not talking about, you know, the climate related impacts. And so that's what we mean when we say that countries aren't taking an integrated approach in how they're reporting and how it's a bit more siloed. And frankly, there aren't, I would say, a lot of really good examples, you know, of countries taking an integrated approach. We do have, in the report, we do talk about, you know, Andorra, their approach in terms of, you know, having a council or committee that, you know, makes decisions on policies based on kind of an examination of the extent to which they're looking at all sustainable development goals and what their impact will be. So there are a few examples that we highlight, but generally speaking, that is a gap. Why that is, it's hard to hypothesize from the voluntary national reviews. But I will say that, you know, this relates to the question of policy coherence as well. And, you know, not all reports cover off that issue. Not all reports talk about how they ensure policy coherence between sectoral policies, national frameworks, how they coordinate institutions, and so on. And so there's a gap there in terms of talking about that policy coordination piece and how that relates to integration in practice, that maybe if that was filled, that would help us understand better how integration occurs in practice.
And I remember just on that point, in chatting with, so one piece that is covered in here, I think, in a best practice is the work of the Supreme Audit Institutions. And so they've been doing audits of a number of countries, your national auditor, on SDG preparedness. And I know that even they're struggling with the fact of policy coherence for sustainable development. What does this look like? And I don't know if there's really any good example of a country that is successfully integrating all the dimensions of sustainable development, successfully coordinating between different government departments. It's challenging. So is there anything that you found in the reports?
I'm trying to remember what, aside from that example I suggested from Andorra, I'm trying to remember examples from the report. I mean, it depends too on how a country understands the concept of policy coherence for sustainable development, because that's something you also see that varies. You know, coming more from sort of the development side of this conversation, when I talk about policy coherence for sustainable development, I'm talking about the impact of domestic and foreign policies on the goals globally and in other countries, right? So what do the agricultural policies of Canada mean for, you know, somebody sitting in another country in the world? You know, how do subsidies affect them, that sort of thing. So, and that's sort of the traditional policy coherence for development debate, which we now call policy coherence for sustainable development. In the high income country reports, we see that conversation. So, I mean, they might talk about, to a greater extent, not all countries talk about it, but I would say to a greater extent. So in that case, when we talk about policy coherence, we're talking about it in a very different sense than talking about the coherency, domestic coherence in terms of the policy frameworks and how they work together and so on. Whereas in, you know, middle income and low income countries, we tend to see the debate more in that sense. You know, where countries are talking about, you know, what they're doing to assess all of their policies against the framework. I guess, and as I'm talking, I'm thinking about the example of Ireland, where they did an assessment of all of their different policy frameworks and institutions, and I think they called it an SDG map, or I can't remember the exact title they gave it, but essentially they mapped all of their policies and institutions against the framework as that starting point to then go, okay, well, you know, how does this all fit together? Who's responsible for what? What does coherence look like? How does that inform their strategies and so on?
So some interesting ideas for starting on that conversation. I think I saw something on there on leaving no one behind. Somebody was just interested in how did they get more details on, I think, the 16 countries you referenced. Would that be as having good practice on leaving no one behind? Would that be in the annex?
So, I mean, the annex provides you with the overview of all of the different countries, but I think the best place to go is to that chapter in the report, where we really dive into the various elements of leaving no one behind. We look at the data element, so whether countries say they have enough data to leave no one behind. We list specific countries who they've identified as being left behind, and perhaps just have the floor to say something interesting about that. We found there was a lot of nuance this year in terms of who's being understood as being left behind versus last year. Last year you would see women, children, persons with disabilities, and so on. Whereas this year, you know, we've had to footnote that table like you would not believe, because it's Roma women, it's, you know, children with disabilities, it's quite specific stakeholders within groups that are often commonly thought of in terms of being vulnerable or left behind. So that was something that I think is more positive, is that countries are actually quite a bit more specific in terms of who is being left behind. And then in the report, we also offer an overview of the actual strategies that countries talk about. So whether they talk about legal reform, whether they talk about policies, cash transfers, you know, specific public supports, those kinds of things. So we do give that information in the report around kind of, you know, much more detailed around the approaches that countries are taking to leaving no one behind.
So we've got lots of other questions. We'll try and capture those and get back to you on them somehow. But I'm going to call on Arabic Voluntary to talk a little bit now. This is an important year, as Ollie has mentioned, for this process. Lots of meetings are being planned. It will be the first high-level summit of heads of state, in theory, around the high-level political forum and the SDGs. So maybe related to that, somebody asked, you know, how can we better connect and share information? So Arlise, you're with World Vision International, but you're also involved in Together 2030. So maybe from your perspective, if we can hear you, let's see if we can hear you. Why is this an important year? What's being planned?
Thank you, Fraser, and great presentation, Shannon. Thank you so much for that. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to see so many of you joining this launching webinar. Really exciting. From World Vision perspective and Together 2030 perspective, we're really very happy to have joined this effort with all of these partners to review the VNR reports. Fraser, 2019 is indeed a big year for a number of reasons. For some organizations and some countries, their priority SDGs is up for review, but as a whole, we have a number of key moments that cut across the entire 2030 agenda for SDGs. So as you were mentioning, yes, the first cycle of review set out by HLPF will come to a close in 2019. It is imperative that we assess whether the cycle system for tracking progress of the SDGs has worked or how well it has worked. Consequently, I think it will set the stage for a review of how HLPF is meeting its mandate with respect to follow-up and review of SDG implementation, keeping track, identifying new emerging issues, and providing guidance, most importantly, providing guidance for reaching and achieving the SDG. HLPF review will actually take place in 2020, but in 2019, we have to start thinking about that review based on the closing of the first cycle. As you were saying, Fraser, HLPF will meet at head of states level for the first time. It will take stock on SDGs implementation. 2019 is also an important year to start taking the pulse on a number of SDG targets that should be met by 2020. According to the SDGs framework, some of its targets, which are critical to groups that have been traditionally left behind, should be met by 2020. And the big question is, will they be met? Are we close to having those targets being met since we are 1 year away? So 2019 actually is paving the way for the SDGs to enter its 5th year of implementation in 2020. And where there were 15 years to implement the SDGs, we now have only 10 years. So the clock is ticking. And some of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, first of all, have never had first years for improving their lives. But so now we have to ask ourselves whether there will be enough time to meet the needs of those people. And here I am thinking about children, for example, whose the first 1,000 days are critical for their life. And similar situation for young people, women, persons with disabilities, and so on. So I think that's something to think about when we think about what 2019 and 2020 means regarding implementation of the SDGs and achieving them. When it comes to civil society, as Shannon has already outlined there and reinforced by Oli, participation in the implementation and review of the 2030 agenda remains a challenge at all levels. And a major call will be for future meetings to provide additional opportunities for the exchange of views and inclusion of civil society reports and expert analysis that are coming through from civil society. As Shannon has already outlined, one of the areas of the report highlights is around the challenge facing the participation of civil society. It highlights that very few VNRs report provide information on formal processes for stakeholder engagement. For just over 30% of reporting countries in 2018, no information was provided on non-state actor engagement in governance mechanisms. So that was already outlined by Shannon. So this is interesting in light of a perception survey that Together 2030 has been released in every year over the last 3 years. In these perception surveys, it found that while awareness of VNR processes had improved on previous years, knowledge of how to actually engage in the processes remained low at less than 40%. So on this, I would also like to highlight one very important message coming out of the report. It is clear that the focused efforts to leave no one behind still receives insufficient attention, and Shannon was already speaking to that. Inclusion of the most vulnerable was also a key area of concern in our perception survey, which found that only 14% of respondents regarding the most vulnerable and marginalized groups are being included. So I reference those findings because it is perhaps not surprising for both these findings, the one to emerge at the same time. The ones that we're looking at the perception survey, which is coming out of the perception of civil society, and what is coming out of the review of the VNRs reports that Shannon just presented to us. So as we know, how likely a lack of inclusion of marginalized peoples is to lead to a lack of efforts to addressing their needs. So just wanted to share those thoughts. In closing, Fraser, coming back to the last portion of your question on opportunities to engage in the HLPF meetings in July and September here in New York, a first suggestion to civil society groups is to connect to any of the partners that have joined up to bring you this report. The Action for Sustainable Development, Together 2030, CAFL, ActionAid, SciSavers, you know, the list, you will find the list in the report. My own organization, World Vision, for the child rights community, we're happy to engage with all of you. We have WWF and others. So I invite you to look at the list and identify whom you can join up. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Arlise. And just again, a reminder that I think Together 2030 has already kind of canvassed its constituency to pull together a set of recommendations for the coming year, and Action for Sustainable Development in partnership with FORCE is doing the same. So already we're thinking about what is it that we want to bring to these big meetings this year. FORCE is a platform, international organization that brings together different national platforms from the North and South. I'm going to call on Deirdre de Burka to talk next, just to let us know there's lots of opportunities for engagement. How is FORCE engaging its members to up their level of capacity and engagement in these processes? Are you there, Deirdre?
I am, yeah. Thanks, Fraser, and good afternoon, everybody. Nice to talk to you. So thanks for asking that question, because FORCE, as many people will know, it's a global civil society network, and our primary focus really is on capacity development of civil society. And I suppose where Agenda 2030 or the SDGs are concerned, we're all aware that really civil society has a huge amount of capacity development to do if we are to be effective in monitoring and implementing the SDGs. So I suppose, 4 strands in the approach we take to building the capacity of our members. The first one is policy and advocacy. So obviously you have to know what you want first and advocate for it in terms of capacity development. Because we're a global civil society network, we want a global approach to the capacity development of civil society. Agenda 2030 is saying civil society must be at the table, must be a key stakeholder. So we're saying, well, we would like to see a global approach to its capacity development, a new global architecture of capacity development institutes, think tanks, platforms, online platforms, and so on, and also a global system of financing that capacity development. So we launched a paper at the High Level Political Forum 2 years ago calling for this, and we have been advocating since then. I have shared a link with you, Fraser, which to the paper that we produced. So perhaps if people are interested in having a look at that, the name of the position paper we developed was Developing the Capacities of Civil Society Globally to Ensure Effective Implementation of Agenda 2030. So we're going to continue, and we're in discussions with the European Commission at the moment to try and get its support for this kind of global approach to capacity development of civil society around Agenda 2030. The second thing we're doing in our overall approach is we're doing some research, and Shannon very kindly helped us with this to look at the VNRs that were submitted by governments, all governments, in 2017 and 2018, and to identify what references to capacity development they're making and in what context. Are they talking about the capacity development of government officials or civil society, or to what extent they seem to be addressing the issue of capacity development and in what way. So we're going to use that to develop a advocacy paper that we're going to bring to the High Level Political Forum this year to look for a more consistent approach by governments to supporting the capacity development of civil society. The third strand to our approach is funding. And I suppose as a global civil society network, we provide sub-grant to our members. We provide funding for what we call national projects. The members submit these, and of them are around capacity development. So we're actually providing direct funding to support the capacity development of our members. And then finally, we're engaging in the concrete provision or providing capacity development at national level. And we're not working on our own with this. We've come together with Ollie from Action for Sustainable Development, and also with the TAP network, which is the Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network. And we are trying to map where we're actually providing capacity development on the ground in different regions so that we don't overlap and that we can actually come together more effectively, pool our resources and provide better capacity development. So this is the first year we're doing that, but we hope to do a lot more of this coordination. Just to finish, I suppose if there is an area that maybe requires more work in terms of capacity development, we would feel it's the whole area of assessing the needs of society where capacity development is concerned, looking at particularly Agenda 2030, where exactly are those needs? Some of our members have told us, well, data gathering and data collection is a big area where we really feel we need to up our game. Others talk about partnerships, the whole business of learning how to engage more effectively and maintain partnerships. But there are many areas where we need to look at identifying where are our needs and where do we need the capacity development. So that's something we believe that civil society should do for itself, identify its own needs. And we're engaging already in a needs assessment with our own members, but hoping to look more broadly with other networks like A4SD and TAP and others to see how we can do that on a wider level. So really that is what Forus is doing on capacity development at the moment, and we're very interested to talk to anybody who'd like to work with us on this area. So please feel free to get in contact. And thank you, Fraser, for your great work on coordinating this report, and Shannon for the amazing research she's done, and I think it'll be a really useful resource for our members.
Great, thank you so much, Deirdre. And maybe just because I think there's a number of people who are interested in what you had to say, if you'd be willing to also just share your email address so they can get in touch with you. And again, Deirdre de Burke was with Forus. Just to say, based on what you said, it's interesting to note that, you know, just as we critique in this report that governments aren't being transparent enough about the challenges that they're facing in areas where there are gaps, it's also important to be mindful that we also have gaps. And so it's great that Forus is also doing an assessment of where you feel among your members there's gaps around capacity and needs, so that we can try and fill those. Maybe before we wrap up, because we're coming towards the end, there was one question just about the HLPF is focusing, as it does, on 6 themes this year. I think the broader idea or the broader theme is empowering people and ensuring inclusiveness and equality. It will be focusing on goals 4, 8, 10, 13, 16, and 17. So education, decent work and growth, inequalities, climate action, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and of course, partnerships. So there's a consultation right now, I guess, in the lead up to that. Is there anything from this report that might be useful to feed into that process?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a number of recommendations that we make in the report on every pillar of analysis that relates to how countries could do a better job at reporting and how they might do a better job in terms of implementing the 2030 agenda. I think for the themes for this year coming up, around inequality is one of the areas where we talk about actually in the report that there really isn't enough reporting on the results of efforts, and there isn't enough reporting in terms of how policies are actually changing. So how are policies changing to reduce inequality, to ensure inclusivity, these kinds of issues. So I think that's one, is really pushing for reporting countries to talk about their changes in their approaches and how it relates to the theme for this year. The other, of course, is just the reporting around leaving no one behind. I think it's critical every year. You know, it obviously has links to the theme for this year. So certainly sort of better reporting on leaving no one behind, understanding what overall approaches countries are taking, how their policies are changing, that sort of thing. And then maybe a final pitch just for, you know, the issue that we raised around making the most of the voluntary national reviews, making the most of the high-level political forum, you know, so best practice, reporting on lessons that have been learned, reporting on the challenges countries are facing, reporting on where they would like to learn from others, where they would like support from others. You know, those are the kinds of things that you know, could really be improved in the reports for this year, but every year of the high-level political forum.
And I think that is something that a number of organizations are trying to do. We all know that the 15-minute presentation by heads of state at the VNR, where you talk about everything you've done in terms of implementation, is only so useful. There were efforts to have different labs to talk through some of the specifics. So those are some directions we want to move. Did you have any final thoughts on those?
Maybe just my final thought would be, dive into the report, have a look at the table of contents, have a look at the chapter summaries, and know that there will be something in there that will be interesting for you.
Great. So that's maybe a good reminder. We're coming towards an end. We're going to pop up the page and also the link. So that's where you can find the report along with a whole host of things, including a 2-page key findings summary, in English, French, and Spanish, the executive summary, which is a little bit longer, the PowerPoints that we presented today, and then the full reports as well. We're hoping we'll put this up as well, the recording from this, so that you can look back at it. I did notice that one person mentioned how this isn't in Russian. We have tried our best to provide different languages. We can't capture them all. This is done a little bit on a shoestring budget, but we are hoping, I think, going forward to try and provide at least the executive summary in Arabic as well, since some of the reports last year were provided in Arabic. So go there. We'll also provide a short link in the chat box for how to get to that page. Thanks so much. We've heard from a ton of speakers today just on the range of different opportunities for engaging in this process, for learning more about what countries are doing, for how you can engage at the national level, the regional level, at the global level. We're counting on you to engage, and there's a number of different organizations who've been involved in this report who are actively looking for organizations to partner with. So feel free to reach out to them. And just thanks all for joining. Thank you to all the organizations who helped make this possible. I'll just maybe give a final shout out to them: ActionAid, Action for Sustainable Development, the Arab NGO Network for Development, BOND, CCIC, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, FORCE, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Site Savers, Together 2030, World Vision International, and WWF UK. And we also got some additional financial support from Child Fund Alliance, Christian Children's Fund of Canada, Waterloo Global Science Initiative, and UK SSD. And of course, I should have mentioned as well the Centro de Pensamiento Estratégico Internacional, CEPE, in Colombia, that was of course involved in the steering of this report as well. So thank you to everyone. Enjoy your Wednesday. It's been a long 4 months. Thank you so much, and hope we have convinced you to engage in this process, to engage in the report. Happy reading.